Let's talk about Cuban doctors, Ben Burgis, author of Give Them an Argument, Logic for the Left.
Yeah, so
Cuba is a totally heroic country, and Castro's one of the best leaders of the 20th century. I'm not going to, all my, broader commentary still stands. I don't idolize anything, but no more soft pedaling it. It is what it is.
Yeah, I mean, I think that let's put it this way, right? I mean, like wherever you come down about what's good and bad about Cuba or its system, you pretty much have to be a sociopath not to think that its international medical missions were an incredibly strong point of the good column. I mean, like I have seen some like blue check mark, mainstream journalists who are just that sociopathic, that saying things on Twitter like, "Oh, don't glorify this, foreign policy operation of, repressive blah blah blah." But like, I think if you're made of human parts, you pretty much have to see that what Cuba has done, just in this case, we could talk about the last week, or in general, we can talk about the last 60 years, really puts a lot of countries with a lot more resources to spare to shame.
Let's really go. Let's go through it. Let's put the article up on screen and just talk about it really specifically. Some of the extraordinary accomplishments of the Cuban health system, not only for delivering, of course, universal health care for a poor country that is still under siege to this day by a blockade and attempts at coups by the United States, but actually as a global mission that has delivered health care across the world, helping people everywhere, on most continents.
Yeah, absolutely. So Cuba obviously has a nationalized healthcare sector. Despite some, market reforms in the last couple of decades, it still is a mostly nationalized economy, but that's the one that's relevant here. Although the other one that's relevant, of course, is their education system, because they've put so much of their priorities, so much of their resources into those two things, healthcare and education. At the intersection between those two, they have more doctors per capita, right? More doctors per 1,000 people by a lot, right? Yep. Than any other country in the world, literally. So that's not like countries that are comparable in this or that respect, but you go through the list of doctors per capita in various countries, and Cuba, which is over 8 doctors per 1,000 people, is vastly, so to put that into perspective, the United States has 2.6 doctors per capita. Canada has 2.6. China has 1.8. South Korea has 2.4. Italy has 4.1. Which, by the way, off topic, but should be terrifying right now that Italy started off with so many doctors per people than we do. But Cuba has 8.2, right? So twice as many as Italy, and which is part of what gives Cuba such amazing health outcomes, considering that it is a very small, very poor country that's been under economic blockade by its largest natural trading partner for almost 60 years. And it also means that they have this long-standing tradition of internationalist medical aid being sent all over the world, right? So some of that is to victims of disasters, right? So, for example, after the big earthquake in Haiti, Cuban doctors and nurses were sent to that country. In 2016, when Hurricane Hurricane Matthew, killed a lot of people there. Again, doctors were sent to Haiti. 2011, Hurricane Katrina. Cuba actually offered to send doctors and medical equipment to the Gulf Coast in the United States and was rebuffed. And of course, as Milton Alamati referred to earlier, 2014, Cuban doctors were sent to various countries in West Africa to fight the Ebola outbreak. All of these are cases, we'll get to what they're doing right now for coronavirus, but all of these are cases where Cuban doctors were sent on these international medical missions to deal with some particular disaster or emergency. But they also have longstanding missions just in poor countries that have shortages of doctors, even when there is no special emergency going on, right?
Yep.
So, for example, during the years when the Workers' Party was governing Brazil, they welcomed in a large number of Cuban doctors into that country. When a friend of the show, Jair Bolsonaro, was running for president, he repeatedly denounced them, said they weren't real doctors, that they were there to do communist indoctrination. He actually said just last year that the Cuban doctors were there to train cells for guerrilla insurgency. That's an actual thing that came out of his mouth.
That's true.
And so when he assumed the presidency, he kicked most of the Cuban doctors out of the country. And of course, as we all know, before possibly getting it himself, there's a very tangled story there. Bolsonaro said that the virus was a hoax, that you didn't need to worry about it. It was like the flu. And then as reality started to set in, he's actually begged the Cubans to send the doctors back, right? Eventually, at least in many cases, even with a clown fascist like Bolsonaro, necessity trumps ideology. So there's this extremely long tradition which has continued right now. So Cuba has recently sent a bunch of doctors to Jamaica to help fight the coronavirus there. To Venezuela, where there's a long-standing tradition, of hosting Cuban doctors there, but they've stepped up those efforts to help fight the coronavirus. And now to Italy, which has no previous tradition of Cuban doctors going there, because it's a wealthy country with a good healthcare system. But of course, now that it's been totally overwhelmed by the pandemic, there was just a mission of Cuban doctors who were just sent there for that. And it's also worth talking about what they've done, what they've started to do domestically to fight the virus, which I think contrasts very favorably with what's going on, well, certainly in this country. So they've shut down the tourism industry, which is a hard sacrifice because Cuba doesn't have a lot of, that's one of their main industries. They don't have a lot to spare. But despite this, they haven't very, very far from taking the sort of, xenophobic tone of a Trump, focusing on kicking out foreigners. Actually, when the cruise ship Bremer was this British cruise ship that had several confirmed cases on board and dozens of passengers and staff members who were displaying symptoms, and it was going bouncing around from port to port in the Caribbean, and nobody would take them in. Then the British government reached out to both the United States and Cuba to try to see if they could figure anything out, and obviously,
no.
Yes.
No. Sorry, Boris.
Exactly. No. Boris Johnson's ideological counterpart and friend in the United States said no, and Cuba said yes, even though at that time Cuba only had 10 confirmed cases on the whole island.
Right.
And taking these people in, they knew they were in grave risk of greatly increasing that number. But they said, obviously, this is a humanitarian crisis. We all have to band together. The sort of thing that demented communists say.
Right, exactly. Horrible people.
Yeah, exactly.
I really would have been much better if like some type of like Gambino family syndicate that the United States has been trying to reimpose in Cuba for 60 years was in power there.
Yeah, or sure, absolutely. Or if it was, the sort of healthy functioning democracy that the United States has fostered in Haiti, for example.
Right. Or here, where we literally are run by some type of weird Gambino syndicate administration.
Yeah, no, if anybody's read the novel Infinite Jest, there's a gimmick in there that in the future, instead of calling years by numbers, the naming rights to years are auctioned off to corporations. So a lot of it's set during the year of the Tux medicated pad. And that's all I could think of when I was watching that early Trump press conference where he had the CEOs from Walgreens and CVS and Rite Aid and Walmart, in this little parade, okay, guys, this is the one from CVS. We all know CVS.
We all know the tremendous work of Walgreens. They're really the Medici family of our time.
Yeah, it's called subsidized time in Infinite Jest.
Yeah. So instead of following that model, because Cuba does still have a mostly nationalized economy, they've done things like redirecting factories that ordinarily produce school uniforms to produce face masks, right? To do mass production of face masks, which is the kind of thing, of course, that we could, even without the nationalized economy, we could be doing in this country, right? If Trump had invoked the Defense Production Act early enough. But I think that there's a difference between having something like that be this kind of state of exception, special emergency thing that you can do where the government temporarily takes over the normal prerogatives of capital, and just having this government-owned factory that, you say, like if we actually had nationalized General Motors back when conservatives were freaking out about it, calling it government motors, then a couple months ago it wouldn't have been a big deal, when this stir first started looming, to be like, hey, if some of the more pessimistic projections we're hearing come to pass, we're going to need a shitload more ventilators. And you could have just had those government-owned auto plants produce them. And hey, best case scenario, it'll be like producing some fighter jets that we don't need because we don't go to war, right? It'll be fine. You don't have to worry about, is it a big enough emergency to justify, the Defense Production Act. In Cuba, they can just say, looks like we're going to need a bunch more face masks. Let's produce more face masks. They've also opened up several military hospitals around the island for civilian use in anticipation of the need for more hospital beds. And again, they've got, it's as this, small island without that many resources that's been under economic embargo from this gigantic natural trading partner for 60 years. Obviously, it comes into this with a lot of disadvantages, but one of the huge advantages is that it started out with twice as many doctors per capita as Italy had, and significantly higher. Like I think there's an even higher disparity with South Korea, which is an example of a country that has done a better job of dealing with this. And I guess the last thing I want to emphasize about this is that this is in keeping with their standard approach to disasters, right? So like if you look at hurricanes that have ravaged both Cuba and parts of the United States over the course of the last decade, in the United States, because there's this laissez-faire approach, hey, we're going to order you to evacuate, but like, it's up to you, figure it out, right? In Cuba, when they have hurricanes, they have this really well-oiled evacuation machine where there's the representative from your like neighborhood defense council comes around, tells you exactly where your family spot is in the shelter. You can bring your household pets with you. There are veterinarians, et cetera, et cetera. So despite the fact that the United States, is the richest country in the world, and Cuba is very far from that, right? Because of this all hands on deck kind of approach to emergencies, it's very common that hurricanes that kill people in the United States don't kill anybody in Cuba.
Cuba is very heroic in many key ways.
You just watched a Michael Brooks show video. Subscribe to get them all. Why wouldn't you? Don't be foolish. Click subscribe below and become a patron as well. Patreon.com/TMBS. Thanks, everybody.